Good. Well, look, we'll kick off. So yeah, hello everybody. So my name is Lauren Rickards. I'm a professor over in the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies and director of the Urban Futures Enabling Impact Platform. A mouthful. And for those of you who aren't very familiar with the Enabling Impact platforms, there's 8 of them, and they're designed to cut across the colleges, cut across schools, bring together people in interdisciplinary groups in order to tackle real world problems. And so do a lot of kind of matchmaking, a lot of connecting out with government, industry, community groups, really trying to push the impact agenda at RMIT through that. So sadly, actually, one of my last days, I'll be completing this role in about a week's time, moving to La Trobe to focus on my own area of research impact, which is climate change impacts and adaptation. But I'll still be a close friend of RMIT and all this work. So it's a real honour to be able to lead this symposium. So it's a collaboration with the College of Design and Social Context to really kind of celebrate the work that is on show during the milestones. So to give it a bit of a conference feel, so rather than it feeling like it's a compliance step or something that you're sort of like working through, you know, just in your own little quiet world of pain, actually celebrate the fact that like this is, you know, a moment to come forward, everyone can share where they're up to, etc. And so this is to kind of, yeah, try to cultivate that sort of climate and also to, you know, celebrate intellectual dialogue, you know, really kind of grab, thank you so much, Eden. Wish it's like losing our AV guy. Okay. And celebrate the chance to talk about our research with a range of others. So I am going to try. God, the second he leaves the room, I need to get my mouse to go up. There it is. Okay. Okay, so this year or this particular symposium, and there will be 4 of these symposiums this year, 2 arranged by Social Change, which is another one of those enabling impact platforms led by Lisa Gibbon, and 2 on urban futures. And the topic I've chose for this year's, or this one, is called atmospheric futures, and that's both because atmospheres are core to our future, but also because this idea of futures is also quite atmospheric in its own way. And so stretching the metaphor perhaps more beyond the bounds of reasonable sense, I've stretched that across to the idea of vacuums and linked that to this very, very core idea, not just for HDR research, but absolutely any research, which is the idea of the gap. So what we have today is 3 really exciting presenters. You know, I'm really thrilled to have this highlight set of particularly I say young female ECR or mid-career researchers talking about this from really interesting but complementary perspectives. So first up, we have Katherine Clifford, who's joining us all the way from Boulder, Colorado, who's going to be talking about her work. So Katie is in the School of Geography over in University Colorado Boulder and a couple of other institutions as well, and completed her thesis in 2019, looking at this topic of dust, and a really good illustration of one of the kind of takeaway messages from today, which is that turn the issues and difficulties you have in your thesis into data. Everything you're doing when you're researching the world is about the world, and very much, you know, think about how you can bring it into your thesis. Next up, we're going to have Natalya Turkina, who is a Vice Chancellor's Research Fellow here at RMIT, who does really fascinating work, particularly in the context of sort of recent global events. Probably since you even started, it's become more and more relevant. Natalya, who's looking at fossil fuel companies, particularly Russian oil companies. It's going to be talking about that work. And Natalya is in the Graduate School of Business and Law. And then we have Dana McKay, who's here with us in the room. Thanks, Dana, our STEM representative here today from the School of Computing Technology. And Dana is a senior lecturer in innovative interactive technologies. And so will hopefully assist me as I prove my complete uselessness when it comes to tech. So, but before we jump in, I just wanted to just really sort of just very quickly position this. So when I kind of bang on about stuff to my own HDR students, I'm always really insistent on really trying to be very precise about the kind of gap that we work through and being very, very clear about where we are trying to angle our thesis and our work. And I should say, please, you know, feel free to like jump in and ask questions. But so the kind of three kind of main kind of areas that I feel you need to sort of work through is, you know, has this been done before, where this is usually considered empirically? And so, you know, what existing research has been done on this? And that's something we'll come back to in a second. The question then is what methodologies? So what do we know about? So if the empirical research is the topic, what do we know about it? What sorts of questions have been asked? What sort of methodologies have been used to bring to bear on that? And, you know, it's no secret that, of course, different methodologies yield very different perspectives. And so you may find that something's been absolutely researched to death, but you still can bring something novel by bringing a fresh methodology in. And of course, very closely associated with methodologies is the question of your theoretical lens. So again, you know, it might be that you're using a really, really well honed theoretical lens. Let's say you pick up Michel Foucault's governmentality, but you go and you apply it to a different context, a context where it hasn't been applied. Likewise, you research something really thoroughly researched, but you bring a different theoretical lens. So when you sort of work through all that, you start to get a sense of kind of what's novel, what's your contribution. Now, we tend in the academic world to have this enormous faith in our academic search engines to tell us about what existing research has been done. And so that existing empirical research, we put our search terms in there. We might do a bit of a sort of scalar thing. We might say, okay, this has been researched a lot in, you know, the Northern Hemisphere, but less so in the Southern Hemisphere. It's been researched in Australia, but less so in Victoria. I'm looking at it in the context of Footscray, and that has, you know, like you can kind of get more and more specific. But even as we do that, we still tend to kind of take in a fairly kind of unquestioning way that idea that the gaps that remain. So once you kind of do that carving, it's the idea that the gaps that remain are simply because people haven't got around to doing it. And you're like, oh, good, nobody's done that. Excellent. I'm going to go do it in my neighbourhood, etc., etc. What I want to do today is really kind of hone your more critical thinking skills and start asking why. Is it just that people haven't got around to it? Or maybe some things are hidden. Maybe some things are systematically not studied. Maybe there's like some gaps here that actually are not about the reality of the world. They're simply about what academic knowledge is about the world. And that's a really, really important distinction. It sort of, you know, gets into the political economy of research, but that's the sort of critical thinking. Why? Why is this a gap? Start asking the why question. Okay, so what we're going to do today is going to hear three talks from our speakers. First of all, starting off this idea, which we call it sort of the systematic knowledge gap from Katie about her work on dust. Then we're going to talk about the sort of strategic knowledge gap. Natalya is going to talk about that too. And that's certainly something that I have definitely found in my own work around climate change and the drivers of it. A lot of stuff is strategically unknown. And then we're going to dive into something that's relevant to all of us, even in our everyday lives. Forget just research, which is the role of the socio-technical systems we use to try to work out what is known or not known, and the ways in which that systematically shapes what we do too. Okay, over to you, Katie. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for bearing with me during this. Okay, so I am first of all, I want to thank you all for inviting me, and Lauren especially. I'm really very honored and thrilled to be thinking alongside such a awesome lineup and alongside graduate students who I think often are doing some of the most interesting thinking. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the story of doing my own dissertation research and the many absences, uncertainties, and inscrutabilities that originally felt like research roadblocks, but actually became quite generative, quite productive. And albeit they, somewhat redirected my dissertation research, they moved it towards more fertile ground and I think to more powerful work. So very quickly, Lauren already introduced me, but again, I'm a human environment geographer, and I work on climate adaptation issues and do engaged scholarship. And today, as she said, I'm going to be talking about systemic knowledge gaps with a focus on dust, or using dust as a case study to highlight some of these issues. And my story with dust starts before graduate school. Actually, right after undergrad, I moved to the Rocky Mountains in the US to work as a naturalist. So that meant I led hiking, ski, snowshoe tours, where my job was to educate participants about the local environment. I was supposed to answer questions to say why things looked and worked the way they did. But that winter turned out to be a heavy dust on snow winter, and that's just what it sounds like, dust landing on snow. And I was trying to explain a phenomenon that was surprisingly hard to understand. And this actually led me to grad school to think about the impacts of dust and snow and how to manage it. Did that advance for you guys?
Yeah, that's good.
Great. Okay. So my research focuses on fugitive dust in the American Southwest. So I will say this is very US focused, so apologies. But fugitive dust is the technical term for dust that is produced from dispersed rather than point sources. And it has a significant history in the American West. And by many accounts, fugitive dust is increasing. So we could take, for example, a decade ago, the winter of 2009, when the snow in the Colorado Rocky Mountains was painted red by 12 dust storms in what was later classified as an extreme year. And this is repeated since. Mountain communities glowed in eerie red, electronics clogged with particles and stopped working, dust seeped into homes through cracks and crevices, locals coughed as they inhaled it. Newspapers reported that communities were embattled in a desert war and that the skies wept mud. And community members compared it even to a biblical plague. Dust affronted the senses through taste, touch, and especially sight. It was everywhere. And a reminder to folks who don't think about dust all the time that elevated quantities of dust carry social and environmental consequences. They strip topsoil at their source, create visibility and respiratory health hazards during transport, and they paint communities red during deposition. And furthermore, when dust is deposited on snow, it can alter the hydrologic regime by rapidly increasing the speed of snowmelt. And this is in an arid region where water is already overallocated and fiercely contested. This is in the Colorado River region, which, if any of you have noticed, is quite dysfunctional in our management of it. So when I started my graduate work, I set out to understand, document, and maybe even quantify some of these various social environmental impacts. But I hit roadblock after roadblock. I thought scientific trends would be a good place to start, but I found that some scientific studies pointed to an increase in the Southwest. And so when I say the Southwest, I'm looking at these 4 states, the 4 corner states, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. So, I looked and saw some pretty clear signals of an increase right there. But then, I found other work, particularly our government monitoring network, which showed a really opposite story of a decrease in the same time, in the same place, which left me feeling confused and a little frustrated. Even the most basic questions about dust remained unanswered, partially answered, or narrowly answered. Is dust increasing? How much dust is there? How should we measure it? How do we regulate it? What are its social impacts? What are its environmental impacts? even seemingly basic questions like, what is dust? Theoretically, these questions should be answerable, but obstacles stood in the way. This was perplexing. Why something that I could see with my very own eye and had, did science lack so many understandings and answers about? And these repeated dead ends, while very frustrating, led me to a new research question and pursuit. So rather than studying and trying to quantify the impacts of dust and snow, I turned my direction to looking at why and how does dust remain inscrutable despite being so very visible to the naked eye. Of course, though, there was not one reason, and this is part of a complicated story. So this gets me to a politics of inscrutability. The politics of the production of environmental knowledge has been a long interest of geographers, political ecologists, social scientists who engage with science and technology studies. Yet only recently have geographers, at least, been turning our gaze to what is not known and the politics of that. And by politics, I mean the consequences. So this brings me to my theoretical framing, which is a politics of inscrutability. And my colleague, Professor Adrienne Krebs, and I developed this together when she hit many similar dead ends trying to study groundwater and seeing these persistent uncertainties and systematic knowledge gaps. And together we developed an analytic for examining inscrutable spaces and circulations, and again, this systemic knowledge gaps or uncertainty. So inscrutability means, in the most basic way, a politics of something that is, a state of something that is incapable of being investigated, analyzed, or scrutinized, and something that's not easily understood. And in our work, we argue that inscrutability is produced through many overlapping processes that are different yet overlapping. And if we open up and examine the production of inscrutability, we can illuminate how, why, and by whom elements of nature, at least for our interest, we were looking at the environment, are left beyond knowing. And each type of inscrutability engages different actors, is a product of different conditions, and each carries a distinct politics. And while the outcome of inscrutability can generally be viewed similarly, a lack of knowledge, that the politics of production are different. And so here you'll see we've identified 3 types. We have epistemic contributions. This is referring to epistemology, the way we study something, produce knowledge about it. So this might be what types of issues academic disciplines focus on or don't, how we frame our research questions, what methods we use, our use of tools and instruments, data collection and data management. There's biophysical contributions, meaning that certain things like dust are hard to pin down and understand because of their materiality, their physical dimensions. And this is particularly the case in vast environments with moving and dynamic circulations. So things like scale, size, extent, dynamism, all shape what can be known and not known, this biophysical consideration. And then last is political economic factors shape inscrutability, and this factor influences the consequences and motivations of inscrutability. And in our case, we thought about this both in terms of like legal, political, regulatory frameworks, but also what I think the next speaker is going to talk about, these more politically motivated, sometimes intentional unknowns that are systemically and intentionally left unknown. So this could include flows of capital, again, influences of policy and law, identity, how race and gender, colonialism, all of those might factor into unknowns. And I'm going to take a quick look at how we applied this to dust and how this helped me think through the uncertainties I was hitting in my own research, and what may or may not be useful in, considering knowledge gaps, systemic knowledge gaps in your own work. I'm going to only be going from the surface of each of these, but I'm happy to talk more if there's any questions. So I'll just be giving an example, but not a complete description of how this intersects with my work. So first, if we're thinking about the biophysical contributors to inscrutability in the case of dust, we have vastness, both in vertical and horizontal terms. Dust moves continent to continent often. It's suspended in the atmosphere with vertical vastness. Its heterogeneity is a major issue where there could be a dust storm in one area and, miles away there isn't. And these dust particles are always on the move, and that can make it difficult to, study them, understand them, count them, calculate them. You often rely on point measurements rather than understanding the whole. And they're multiscalar, both temporally and spatially, right? So we have to think about timeframes from the geologic to these really quick, like hourly events. And similarly for spatial, we're thinking across continents all the way to the microscopic. So those all factor into making things hard to know. You can think of this as almost the materiality pushing back against knowing. A second one is epistemic factors. So a big part in dust was actually defining it. Experts, even within a single field, couldn't agree about what counted as dust, and this led to a lot of different definitions of dust, which meant there lacked kind of a larger narrative or body of work. Even when folks would identify themselves as a dust expert or dust scientist, many actually struggled to give a definition of what their focal object was. We also, again, can't measure dust everywhere. We often rely on monitors and, collect data there and then try to assume that those represent a larger area, even though usually they can only represent maybe a couple kilometers. Here, I showed a map for the state of Utah's particulate monitors. And you can see there's 7 in this state, and there's pretty significant portions. The blue dots are population centers. So we see pretty significant number of communities that do not have any data. Lastly, people often will use remote sensing, but you can only use that if it's in daylight. So there's all these challenges to understanding the whole picture. And then political economic contributors. The laws and policies developed to protect air quality focus in the US on urban areas and industrial pollution. And that leaves rural areas where dust is often some of the biggest issues, largely unmonitored. The complicated thing is you need a monitor for any type of regulatory intervention. So not having a monitor not only leaves you not knowing about dust, but it also leaves rural communities without regulatory recourse. And my work also identified a regulatory loophole that allows dust data to be excluded as an outlier when it's counted. So you can again see on this map, the Four Corners region, Colorado, where I am, looks like it has no dust issues, but yet it does. And a lot of the reason it looks that way is because dust is removed from the data set. So in our paper, and I can return to this, we come up with a series of questions for researchers to think about that might help them identify these different contributors. And I've only pulled a couple, but biophysical contributors, thinking about the size, extent, or scale. Epistemic, how do trends in scientific disciplines determine what is knowable and what's left unknown? Political economic, does inscrutability of a space or circulation benefit some and burden others? How so? And then once we pulled them apart, thinking about ways to bring them back together and what that might show. So how do these different types leverage each other? For example, we can see that dust's lively materiality makes it hard to define, and that makes researchers studying it come up with multiple different definitions and multiple different ways to study it, and this prohibits a kind of generalized body of knowledge. So that's an example of a biophysical factor interplaying with an epistemic one, and there's others I'm happy to talk about. And I think these types of questions become particularly important in a moment with environmental change. So while this is a story, again, about dust and systemic knowledge gaps that prevented us to understand that, other issues of environmental change are going to be really important to identify as we're seeing changes to risks and threats and resources, and understanding how and why certain types of changes are known and unknown have increasing importance as we're combating just a number of new environmental issues. So with that, I think my time is almost up. I moved through a lot of that quickly, and it's, you know, a lot of it's based on a paper that I wrote, but I'm happy to answer questions or go in more depth if I move too quickly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Katie. Hopefully you can hear the applause. That was really excellent. And yeah, certainly I think a lot of food for thought for people, you know, regardless of whether we're looking at dust, there's a whole lot there we can take away from that. We're going to keep with this epistemic gaps theme and move over to Dana now. So thank you so much, Katie. I hope you can, are you able to stay online and listen to Dana? Yeah, fantastic.
Yes, I'm excited.
And then we'll move to the political economics. So Katie's work has kind of situated us for the next two talks. Over to you, Dana.
So my name is Dana McClay. I'm sorry to anyone who's online, you're going to get my back. Sorry about that. I study how people find, manage, abuse, ignore information. So that's my whole thing. That's the thing that I've been interested in for a long, long time. I was awarded my PhD in 2019. So fairly recently enough that I feel I can still offer you some advice, which would be get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that's the uncertainty and the state of discomfort is normal for the PhD. It's not just you. Everyone else is feeling the same way. And if they're not, they're probably not doing a good job. So today I'm here to talk to you a little bit about information gaps and how we define our information gaps. Now, let's see, am I going to be able to just... No. So I think if you click on that, there we go. Excellent. So this is the classic quote about information. Donald Rumsfeld, reports that say something that hasn't happened are interesting to me because we don't see them a lot. I mean, how often do you get a negative result when you read a research paper? I was recently doing some reviewing and I reviewed a research paper that said, actually, we tried this and it didn't work. And I gave it a higher score than I normally would because we need these negative reports. We know there are known knowns. We know what we know. We know there are known unknowns. We know what we don't know. But the unknown unknowns, the things that we don't realize we don't know and we need to know, they're the ones that are always going to come back and bite you. And they're the difficult ones to figure out and to define and to study. So what's this picture?
Panicking because he thinks he might have left his phone on the train.
You got a bad economic news and it's having a heart attack.
Okay, so it's a heart attack, right? But this picture, who's the picture of? Probably, given that I've cropped most of it out.
White collar.
White collar worker. We're going to take a guess as to gender. It's a man. So this picture is very much of a heart attack. And it was one of the pictures I used, Adobe stock, for all of the pictures in this presentation. So if you're doing presentations, RMIT has a subscription to Adobe stock and it's an excellent source of images. I typed in heart attack and pretty much all of the images were like this. Mostly white men grabbing their chest, right? That's a typical male pattern heart attack. And if you Google heart attack symptoms, this is what you get: chest pain or discomfort, feeling weak, lightheaded or faint, pain or discomfort in the jaw, neck or back, pain or discomfort in one or both arms or shoulders, shortness of breath. Sounds like a heart attack to me, except that it's kind of not. Because women have really, really different heart attack symptoms. This is something that's only been really talked about in the past 15, 20 years, because until then, we just assumed that all people had heart attacks in the same way. But actually, women are more likely to die of a heart attack than men are once they've had one, because they're less likely to recognize that they're having a heart attack. Because when they Google heart attack symptoms, thinking, oh, I feel a bit funny, they get this list. So only once you Google heart attack symptoms for women that you get a list that represents the symptoms that you might have as a woman. Now, I mean, this isn't universally true. My father-in-law over Christmas had a typical female pattern heart attack. And fortunately, because there'd been ads on TV in New Zealand, he recognized that that might be what was happening. And those ads on TV saved his life. So where you get your information from matters. Just for what it's worth, I did this search on Bing, and the results were the same for both heart attack and heart attack for women, and they were a much more inclusive list of symptoms. But think about who develops these tools as well. Who develops the tools that we use to look for information? So when you do a search for literature, or when you're trying to find literature in your field, what are the strategies that you use to find something to read about your field? You are going to have to talk to me on that kind of question. Sorry.
You find a key article and look at the references, and then you look at who cites it.
Citation chaining? Yep, great. Google Scholar, yep, and Google. So searching, also great. Any other strategies for how you might get or look for information? Library, okay. Browsing through things in the library. Browsing through journal issues. Does anyone do that anymore? Yeah, a few people. And recommendations from people. Oh, you must read, even if it's Reviewer 2. Reviewer 2 often does give you something useful to read. So, you know, when you get those references from Reviewer 2, do read them. Those were pretty much the ones I came up with. Search, browsing, citation chaining, and the things that the people we talk to about our research recommend to us. Now, I mean, these things all have some problems, and we'll talk a little bit about those. So one of the questions is, where do you search? Because where you search is going to return you different results. Now, this sizes and overlaps are not representative, right? Like there's probably much more overlap between Google Scholar and EBSCO and the university library. But the point of this is to just show you that you can type a search into your search engine of choice, whether it's Google Scholar or EBSCO or the RMIT library search, and you'll get very different things back because they index different things. They also rank in really different ways. So my PhD was on browsing. That was the thing that I was interested in. And I typed in browsing to Google Scholar and the RMIT library search. There is no overlap at all between the first 4 results. And in fact, I haven't read anything that came up in the first 4 in the RMIT library, which makes me think maybe I shouldn't have been given that PhD after all, but the anxiety continues after you've finished. When I look at the Google Scholar results, and I'm in computing, so Google Scholar indexes everything in my field, along with a bunch of other stuff besides. Yeah, it's going to return a lot of crap, but sometimes you find something interesting. But when I look at these 4 results, this first one, this is a paper that kind of alludes to a book. And the book is really well cited, but the paper is not really well cited. So you see that it's like 327. This one, I don't understand, 346, but I will point out that the second author works for Google. This third paper, which is the only one that has a female author at all, is cited by nearly 3,000 people, but it's item number 3. And it's the thing that I would say anyone who studies this needs to read. And this one, I don't even know what this one is doing here. I know both the authors of that, and I don't think either of them would be hurt to say that I don't think it has that much to contribute to the conversation anymore. Like, it was interesting when it was published because we talked about browsing as though it was a thing done by one person, but that was 1997. And again, not super highly cited, right? It's only got around 400 citations. So we have no idea how these rankings are calculated, is kind of what I'm trying to say here. But there might be some inherent biases. I don't think, to be abundantly clear, I don't think the fact that Ed is at Google has anything to do with the fact that his thing is ranked number 2, but it could. You know, we literally don't know. So how you search also matters. The things you type into the search box make a difference to the things that come back. It turns out we search super differently. If you give 100 people a topic, chances are, even for something like beef stroganoff, you're going to get 70 different search results back. Literally, that experiment has been done. So what would you type in to get a recipe for beef stroganoff? Give it to 100 people, you get 70 different things that people type into Google. Now, these 3 pictures here are, again, from Adobe stock. So thank you, Adobe stock, for proving my point. Climate emergency, first result. Climate change, first result. Climate hoax, first result. The way you search really matters. And we all have disciplinary differences in the words we use to describe the same problem. One of the key problems of interdisciplinary research is learning to speak each other's language. This is a known thing. So, you know, the things you type in will make a difference to what comes back for you. Citation chaining, well, it can be the work of Sisyphus if you look at everything. So it's a lot of work, but you might find some diamonds in the rough. Except that there are some things about how to get cited. One of the best ways to get cited is to be American, because the American tenure mill requires people to be cited. So when they do reviewing, they'll be like, cite me, cite me, cite me. And of course, they all cite each other. So there's this whole thing of being American is an excellent way to get cited. Work with someone famous. People who early on in their career, Joanne, this is going to work nicely for you, work with someone famous will get cited more often. Have a name that's closer to the front of the alphabet. I'm pretty sure this is down to how EndNote kind of sorts things by default. And the kind of frantic, oh, I need something to cite for that thing in the last minute. But also in economics, where authors are ordered on a paper by alphabetical order according to surname, you are more likely to get tenure if your name starts with A than if it starts with F, because the paper becomes Adams et al. Be in a field like machine learning that has high levels of citation. You know, that will also get you a great H-index in citation. This is kind of addressed by things like the field-weighted citation index, but it doesn't help. Be a man. That's an excellent way to get cited, and have a European-sounding name. Also a great way to get cited. Sorry, everyone. The one thing that you can change that is a good way to help you get cited is be part of a team. But my point is that citation chaining will also cause you to miss things that might be out there, because there isn't what we call citation justice in the world. So browsing's awesome. You can have serendipity and you might spark some great new ideas and you might find something wonderful. But the things that get published in those top ranked journals that are the place you're likely to be browsing are also not equally distributed. That's the tweet on the left there is a word cloud of the authors, the first names of the authors published in top 5 journals in economics between 2005 and 2020. And the person who created that word cloud did it for a few other fields, and it looked fairly similar. This tweet on the right is a study where they essentially kind of gamed the system and put in papers that were putatively from better institutions and from better authors, and papers that were putatively from worse authors, and they were the same papers, and ranked how likely they were to get through the peer review process. Yeah, being famous is a good way to get through the peer review process. So, you know, work with someone famous if you can. So this all paints a picture where we're going to miss things, and we're going to miss interesting things, and we're going to miss relevant things, and we're going to miss things by women and people of color and who are talking about the field in a different way to us. Well, what can we do? One thing we can do is have conversations with a diverse range of people, including people outside academia. and try some of the words they use to talk about the problem you're working on in a search engine just to see what happens. Do browse widely, go to the library and wander around the section on your topic. That is worth doing. Go and look at stuff in bookshops and newsagents about that. Do follow the news. Be open to serendipity. When you read a news article about something that's related to your work, track down the thing it's pointing to, because that's been invaluable for me, and click past the first page of results. Studies have shown that like less than 10% of people will click past page 2. Go to page 6. There's usually something kind of interesting there. So how do we be open to serendipity? Well, the first thing is fortune favors the prepared mind. So, be open to thinking about something that might be to do with your research, and be open to those ideas coming to you as often as possible. Give yourself downtime. I can't stress, actually, just for every reason there is, how important it is to have downtime during your PhD. Do something other than your PhD that makes you happy. Go to the gym, read a book, watch Netflix. Actually, Netflix is terrible for serendipity because it engages too much of your brain. But the kind of doing something where you're not thinking too carefully is a great way of having those serendipitous experiences. Who else gets their best ideas in the gym or in the shower? Because that's where it tends to happen to me. When I'm kind of doing something, but not something that requires too much of my mind. Take different parts. So this is true online and physically. If you take different paths regularly, you train your brain to be open to noticing new things. Be observant and listen to things that you hear. Don't immediately shut down when you hear something that you slightly disagree with, or that has a different take on things. Be willing to have your boundaries broken a bit. That doesn't mean that your supervisor should be emailing you at the weekend and saying, no, you need to do like 10,000 more experiments. But, let information in that otherwise you might not be willing to consider. And let the ghosts of your past come back to haunt you, because they're usually trying to tell you something. So I was going to do a little exercise where we all searched for something on Google, but do we have time?
Yeah, I think so, because you're the one that most time constrained.
Yeah, so I do have to go in 7 minutes. But around your table, run a search for this as though it's an academic. You're looking for systematic solutions that address people in technology and science to make widespread behavioral change in times of crisis. Pull out a device and do a search as though you're looking for academic information about this.
All right. Katie and Natalya, you can do this too. Hopefully you found the email with the slides too. Apologies, I'm not sharing them. Okay, everyone, I'm going to see if I can put some lights on for a couple of minutes. Everyone grab a device or something. Here we go. So you've got a big complex question here. What do you search for? How do you start saying, has anyone researched this? What can I lean on? Okay. Can I say that this sort of like 10-minute exercise is what you get paid to do as a consultant, and then you go and you deliver the solution. That's the level of research.
Walking around the room. Some of you have gone to Google. Some of you have gone to Google Scholar, and some of you have gone to the RMIT library. Did anyone go somewhere else? Yep.
I would normally go to Scopus.
So yeah, Scopus.
Yeah.
But also that's challenging as well, because like if you're not part of the academia and you're trying to search for this kind of information, normally these kind of journals and web pages require subscriptions, or also it's quite tough to go outside of these areas.
Yep.
That's my take.
You go to my
Yeah, but still.
Yeah.
I mean, if you know about Google Scholar, it's pretty good at surfacing free versions of things if they exist. So who wants to share what they typed in? Is anyone willing to share what they typed in? Yep.
I would do technology and in brackets behavior change crisis.
Anyone else?
Is that behavior assessment in times of crisis?
Yep.
Is it behavior changing crisis?
Yep. So you can see that even within this room with a relatively, okay, admittedly, I gave you a topic that I figured was likely to prompt different search terms based on our own particular interests. But, you know, we're typing in different things. Where titles of first results for people.
I've got a result, large scale auto GPS analysis, discerning behavior change during crisis.
Yep. Anyone get anything different as their first result? Yep.
Solving environmental problems that behavior change respect.
Yep, so your results focused on environmental problems. This was deliberate because I thought some of it will be about COVID, some of it will be about climate change. There might be a bit of natural disaster stuff thrown in for good measure. But you can see how we've all interpreted this question differently. We've searched differently. We've got different first results. So really trying to make our searches wider and deeper, you know, looking at more of the results. And typing in different words can help us to see some of those things that, you know, might otherwise be hidden from us by these socio-technical systems that, let's be honest, are designed by white men mostly. So maybe missing all sorts of things. Just some food for thought. I'm really sorry I have to go because this was originally scheduled for a different time, but it's been lovely to talk to you all and I hope it's given you food for thought going forward.
All right, thank you so much. All right, we're going to all, I think, be pondering this for, you know, each time we now search Google multiple times a day, Dana. So thank you so much.
There are some resources at the end of the slides, so I'm quite happy to share the slides too, Laura.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, would people like, I'm sure probably all the slides, yeah, terrific. Where you said, yep. Repeat in your groups for some of your, yeah.
So you might want to do that as an exercise later to describe your research problems that you're tackling and see what other people can come up with. This might be a way of getting some of the things you haven't seen.
Absolutely. Okay, so last but not least, we now have Natalya here, who I think you wouldn't mind me saying she's got a gorgeous bub with her too, who we may hear in the background if we're lucky. But Natalya, as I said, Vice Chancellor's Research Fellow here over in the Graduate School of Business and Law, is going to talk about some of the difficulties and challenges and mysteries she's come across as she searches for information too. Over to you, Natalya.
Thank you, Lauren. Hi, everyone. It's so lovely to be part of the symposium, part of this workshop. I learned a lot already from Katie and Dana. I think it's a very important topic overall that we are discussing today, all the possible gaps and how as researchers we can even try to touch on those gaps and maybe reframe them or problematize them. It's interesting how this workshop is very interdisciplinary, and I have learned a lot about dust and other things that are completely new to me as a researcher. But at the same time, it sounds like there are so many similarities across disciplines, which actually means that we are facing similar challenges that we need to address. So I hope you see my slides now. I will be talking about the strategic knowledge gap. And the question I was given by Lauren, why and how is some information about the world kept out of sight and inaccessible? And to be honest, this question made me think a lot about my own research and my position in my research field and my obstacles and challenges that I had as a PhD student, and I'm still having as a early career researcher. I graduated from University of Melbourne as a PhD student in late 2019, and my research was, so it is now generally about institutional and corporate social environment and environmental responsibility, but also irresponsibility. And I look at meanings and practices. I emphasize this because I will give some examples and will show you how this is important to actually talk about meanings and practices, or meanings or practices in my field of research. And you can see my recent published works on institutions and corporate social responsibility. I will touch upon them in my examples. I won't be focusing on one paper in particular, but feel free to read those papers, especially the last one on the Russian institutional context in the Journal of Business Ethics and how institutions in Russia form, shape environmental irresponsibility of oil and gas companies in Russia. So when I started thinking about this question, why some information is kept out of sight and isn't accessible to us, I firstly thought, okay, the most obvious thing that is in my field is that corporations naturally don't like to be in the focus of researchers' expose work. So basically, when you approach a company and ask them about their corporate social or environmental responsibility, they're happy to talk about positive cases. And there are some researchers who are actually paid directly or indirectly by industry to write those positive cases. Sometimes they realize they're doing it, sometimes they don't. And when they don't, it becomes even a bigger problem. So that's quite an obvious thing, why some information is kept from us in my field, in the field of corporate responsibility or sustainability, all this kind of business ethics. So this is the general field I'm working in. So the companies, especially those that are dodgy, that are obviously irresponsible, they will not be willing to give you an interview about their case of oil spill somewhere in Brazil, for example. Or they will give you a story that they think you would like to hear in order to publish a positive case about them. Or they will refer you to their corporate website and say that you can find an information there and it's quite reliable, and that can be a basis as a secondary data for your research. Or you can go and talk to stakeholders and get a bigger picture about what actually the company does. But then I started to think about that there are some other actors in my field that keep this information off-site and make it inaccessible. And those actors are governments, and I will talk about it a bit about it later. But also, most importantly, those people are us researchers. So we keep a lot of information from ourselves when we think about our research, when we start approaching our research methodologically, epistemologically first, and then methodologically. And the way we formulate our research questions, the way we approach those research questions, we may actually keep a lot of information outside of our focus. So basically, the main reasons for us as researchers to keep important information off-site are ontological, epistemological, and methodological, and then theoretical as the result of these three aspects of any research that we do. So basically, the first step is to understand what you research. What is the object of your inquiry? I think when I started doing my PhD, it took me more than a year for sure, but probably the whole period of my PhD to understand what is this that I'm researching, because I started with the question about why corporate social responsibility meanings and practices vary across countries and firms. And my research was in both locations, in two locations, in Mongolia and Western Australia, where I looked at how a large multinational mining corporation interacted with its stakeholders and how meanings and practices of its responsibility towards local communities were formed and contested. So to understand what is this that I'm researching was quite an easy task for me. And I looked a lot at ontology of my research. You can be realist in your ontology, you can be irrealist in your ontology. There are other ways of naming ontologies. This is just one of the categorization, but understanding what it is that you research is the first step towards understanding what information you're going to look for and how. And then understanding your epistemological position is important as well. So are you objective or subjective in your standing? Do you think that you can simply observe the world and produce knowledge? And as Katie's research on dust shows that you cannot really even sometimes define what dust is. I thought for me, if someone asked me in the morning today what dust is, it would be quite straightforward to answer. But now I feel that dust has many definitions, and it's quite uneasy to tackle sometimes. Or you are subjective in your research and you actually think that any knowledge production is theory driven or theory dependent or theory determined, and that should define how you approach your object of research inquiry. So understanding these two things is critical for any researcher, not only for PhD student, early career researcher, but actually for any researcher. I remember when I had when I was still a PhD student, and there was a workshop like this in the University of Melbourne, and I don't remember the topic of the workshop, but one of the professors, he was presenting, and we started talking about the topic of entrepreneurship that he was discussing, and then I asked him about his ontological and epistemological positions, and he said, look, I don't believe in it. I just pretty much do like research/consulting job to help industry thrive in this area. And I started to think about it a lot after this conversation, because I think I kind of I quite disagree with this professor, because I think it's not a matter of belief, whether you believe in your ontological or epistemological position. You always have some. It's either you know or you don't know about it. It's either you are reflective or non-reflective about it. So being reflective about your ontological and epistemological positions helps a lot. Once you know them, you can actually understand very clearly what you research and why. And then you understand what methodological tools, what methods you can use to do your research, to conduct your empirical research. I'm a qualitative researcher, so for me, the methodological tools I usually deploy are interviews, observation, case studies, comparative case studies across different countries, for example, because I look at broader national institutional frameworks, and I look at how institutions at national level or field level form or shape or impact the way organizations understand and practice corporate social responsibility and irresponsibility. So I will give you now some examples from my field and from my personal journey in this area, so you understand better why I think these three aspects of research are important, and why they're important for us as researchers if we want to dig deeper into strategic knowledge gaps. So when I got my first interest in the area of corporate social responsibility, it happened that it was in the mining and extractive industry. I am originally from Russia. That time I was writing my master thesis back in Europe, in Hungary, and that thesis was purely based on secondary data. I was looking at the corporate sustainability or corporate social responsibility reports, and the industry was diamond industry. So I was comparing two largest diamond mining organizations in the world, Alrosa and Botswana. So one is in the northern part of Russia, it's Alrosa, and then the second organization is Botswana in Botswana. So the research was about responsibilities towards different stakeholders, and mostly I was focusing on local communities. And naively then, I started looking at their corporate reports, believing that everything they say there is exactly what they do. And it was a surprise to find out that, for example, in the report produced by Alrosa just before its IPO, because there were no reports whatsoever before then, but before they went public, they started producing sustainability reports. So in 2011, they produced the first report. It was huge. It reflected so many activities that they had been doing by then. So in that report, they mentioned there was a rhetoric on membership in the UN Global Compact. I decided to check the membership in the actual website of UN Global Compact, and they were not member of UN Global Compact at that time. So I thought, okay, that's interesting. You can just write whatever you like in your report. Sometimes people just don't check, and probably many people don't check, especially if you looked at those kind of non-financial reports produced by organizations. Sometimes they take like hundreds of pages. It's very difficult to verify every single statement that they put in those reports, and you assume that they don't lie, but they may lie. So that means that if you look at corporate social responsibility practices, maybe looking at the corporate report is not the best idea to understand whether they really do it or not. That was the lesson I learned at that time. And I brought this lesson into my PhD study. So I continued looking at mining industry. And at that time, when I was already a PhD student, I started focusing on researching corporate social responsibility meanings and practices. So I was aware that there is a decoupling. There might be decoupling between meanings and practices of corporate social responsibility. Moreover, it's not always clear what companies mean by corporate social responsibility. So you need to dig deeper into that part, but then also you need to talk to, or you need to look at, triangulate different sources of data to understand what practices they actually do on the ground. So that was my focus in my PhD study. And of course, it was it was not secondary, but data collected from the interviews. I needed to actually contact managers from mining company I was looking at, but also different stakeholders, NGOs, local governments. And while some of them were happy to be interviewed, the company was really hesitant to actually give me access to data. So I needed to wait for at least 6 months to get access to my second case. And the way organization tries to limit your access to data is not really straightforward. Sometimes they agree to be interviewed, but they give you only 30 minutes for an interview, for example. And it's understandable in some cases when you are interviewing a top manager. Obviously, their time is very expensive and they don't have that time. But sometimes it's a strategic step for them to actually talk less and talk only about those things that they are willing to present to you as a researcher. So you need to be mindful about how you get your data, what data you get, and what you can extract from that data. Then, after I graduated from my PhD and I produced dissertation, because at some point I realized that, okay, my data is not ideal, probably my analysis is not ideal either. I need to finish this dissertation, and you know the best dissertation is the finished one. So I graduated, and then I started to look at the same data. I'm still publishing out of my PhD, but the way I look at the data has changed a lot. And now I look at the data I collected through the prism of critical management studies, through the prism of, for example, post-colonial perspective. So the way I theorize the data, the way I interpret it, is now a bit more critical, and that makes that opens something new that I didn't see when I was actually collecting and analyzing data in the first place. So I think this whole story and this example that I have given to you, they are all about how we as researchers keep a lot of information off-site and make this information inaccessible, because we just simply either look at different things that we are not supposed to look at, or we don't know how to triangulate data, and we are constrained by time boundaries or grant boundaries, or by the research team that see this project in a different way. We are also constrained by the fact that nowadays in business research, there is a lot of expectation that business researchers are somewhat consultants to industry, and the industry is actually expecting you to produce positive cases. And what if the case is not positive at all? Are they willing to work with that information, with that case? Are they willing to make it published, get it published? I don't know. I think there are a lot of challenges for business researchers who are willing to take rather critical perspective than mainstream consulting stance in this area. Another example I will give you just from the field overall is about how the link between ontological and epistemological and methodological aspects of corporate social responsibility research is that for many years it has been popular to do research of this kind. So a researcher asks a question about whether it's financially feasible or beneficial, or depending on what exactly you're looking at, for a company to be responsible, either socially or environmentally, or in both ways. So what these researchers have done, they actually looked at the financial data, looked at some indices that indicate that company is doing something in the field of corporate social or environmental responsibility. They linked the two, and they showed some correlation between the two, hoping to impact organizations, and hoping that organizations can actually become more responsible if they see that there is a link between their bottom line and those practices. So in this kind of approach to corporate social responsibility research, the ontological position very often is such that you pretty much either look at the corporate report and you believe that what is written there is reflecting the actual practice, or you go to a corporate manager and in a survey you ask that manager, are you responsible? Do you think your company is responsible? Great, you're responsible. How exactly you're responsible? And the manager gives you some examples. So it's a pretty naive empirical research. You can see from the way I'm talking about it that I'm not really doing that kind of research. I find it a bit misleading for the broader society foremost, because it seems that, yes.
I was just going
Yes.
to say, maybe just the last few minutes. Yeah.
Yes, I'm actually wrapping up because I don't have much to say. So you can see that this is the example from a broader area. Now, this is the main focus of what I was going to talk about today. I will leave you with these takeaway conclusions from my research in this area and from my observations, and I'm happy to distribute these slides to you so you can see the actual references and maybe read those papers. But basically, 5 lessons I would like to share with you are this: that first, know your ontology and epistemology and methodology. Also know your researcher and the identity. Like for me, it was a movement from critical management studies to a more orthodox social issues and management or organizational and management theory, and then back to critical management studies. And that's okay if you are changing, as long as you are reflective about that. Then know your question. It's not necessarily a knowledge gap. It might be a problematization of what has been already done through a meta-theoretical lens. And if you read Alvesen and Sandberg on that, you will know what I'm talking about. You may complexify your research problem or gap. You may actually look at what other has been looking at from a more complex perspective. So against here, Tsukas is going against those researchers that say that we need to simplify in order to understand things. He actually says, no, the world is complex around us, so our research must be. Then the fourth conclusion I would like to share is that absent has causal power. We may look in our research to possible absences and absent possibilities. And here critical realism can be useful to understand a bit more about that. And Katie was actually mentioning in her presentation today that absences are important to look at. But also be reflexive in your data collection. Alvesen and his paper talks about reflexivity in interviews. It's a very interesting paper that gives you an understanding of how both interviewer and interviewee are building their identity and are doing many other things during an interview, and how it can impact the way we see data and then interpret it and then theorize based on that. I will finish here. These are the papers I was talking about, but that was my presentation, and I'm happy to answer your questions and have a discussion about it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Excellent. We'll share all these slides afterwards as well. I think there's a bit of a lag there to the slides. Thank you so much. So much to think about there, and I'm sure some of those conundrums that Natalya talked about are ones that your supervisors and independent experts and others around you have posed multiple times. Could I just ask if you just hit the on the top button there, we'll get some light going. Yep, thank you. Excellent. So first of all, does anyone have any direct questions for Natalya about some of that work in her own journey there? So we've had 3 speakers, all who've completed their PhDs in 2019. So, you know, it's you know, still fresh. Certainly, I mean, some of the things that really resonated from my own perspective. First of all, that idea of kind of not trusting and reading documents naively, really positioning them within a bigger kind of, you know, ecosystem of like, why is this produced, who's it produced, what's it performing, so the performative nature of different documents is really, really crucial. You know, in terms of the speaking to corporate managers, so asking them a survey, are you responsible, yes or no? Understanding the bias, hopefully that wouldn't get through human ethics, but possibly with, but you know, understanding the bias built into that. In my own work around climate change, you know, we really talk a lot about the black boxes. So, and some of those have come out in the news more recently about how knowledge has been known. I'm talking here about emissions data in certain other fossil fuel companies as well. Things are known, but they're not going to tell you that they're known. So that's what Lindsay McGooey talks about as strategic ignorance. If anyone would like to see a kind of real world example of strategic ignorance being played out, then please log on to the latest videos from the RoboDebt Parliamentary Royal Commission and watch some of those ones, particularly yeah, there's some ministers, and yeah, you can watch them squirm, like no recollection of this, that, and the other, but also related to this, one of the partners from PricewaterhouseCoopers, big accounting firm, who can't recall how much money they made out of RoboDebt. They don't have the systems to tell you that. Yeah, that's called lying under oath, that is. Anyway, I digress. So yeah, so thank you so much for that. There's so many things there. What we wanted to do in this sort of session now, just the last sort of closing discussion, is to sort of move it towards your own research and help you start to put all of this closer into practice for yourselves. So riffing off what Natalya's just talked about, what I encourage you to do, sorry if this starts to feel a bit like a cheat, is to talk to those on your table, or just reflect about what information might be being kept from you. So this idea that there's information out in the world, this is a slightly different thing to the, say, lack of data and monitoring that Katie talked about. So that it's not that Utah is monitoring dust and is just simply not releasing it, though that could be the case. But this is the situation where there's information, but the people who have that information don't want to give it to you. So it's the gatekeeping role. Now, I also want to complement the sort of focus on this studying up, which is what I also did in my PhD. So asking elites for information, which is a particularly difficult task, to also recognise that there's a whole lot of groups, including a lot of marginalised groups, people disadvantaged where you're in the researcher elite role, who may not want to give you information either. So just think about what you're studying and think about who you're engaging with, either directly or indirectly, and why they might be motivated to not give you the information that you're looking for. So, Natalya, oh, she's gone. Right, baby must have called. Literally got like a few months old baby. So yeah, have a chat, introduce yourselves on your table. I'm just going to kind of rip this for the next 20 or 30 minutes, if that's okay. If you do need to go, of course, feel free, you're all adults. But yeah, have a chance to think about on your table that question of what information might be being kept from you and why. Those reasons might be very legitimate. Okay, you're one.